go and say it's time to start.
We've already started. We've already started. It's
Thank you, Adam.
It's great. No, it's great just talking.
No, it's great.
Engaging. But thank you. You be the bell ringer for us, since I'm not particularly interested or good at that. Stephan, thanks for joining us. It's we just do a couple of updates up front and then just kind of get into the conversation, either a presentation or discussion. And so what I've asked Stephan to do today with us is just kind of give us some updates on what's happening. You know, we already did some of that about the AI conference and up and coming stuff. So for us to be aware of what's happening is both interesting, useful. I think it's why people are on the call, just a view into the larger universe out there, and also to sort of triangulate to consent and what this I think pretty much everybody on this call has been involved with the consent work we've been doing over the last couple of years in some way, shape, or form, and several of them are committed to helping implement and design and support it. So it's a great opportunity. New beginning of the year, we had this. Stephan and I had this conversation. Stephan and I go way back, so we've had this conversation now for years about kind of making change at scale, and this is an important point. So anyways, I asked Stephan just to sort of update us on some hot topics, some of the things that are we're probably aware of, but kind of where they're headed. And then, as I said, kind of move towards consent and what we might be able to do, how we're thinking about it. I know ONC is knowledgeable with this, talking to people both in ONC and ACF and CMMI and stuff like that. So it's a whole of government initiative. It's a big thing, really, in many ways, if we think about consent. So we'll dive into that, and we'll spend most of the time just talking about that, open up the floor, and hopefully get people's questions as we go forward with that. But with that, I know we have a couple of work group updates that we want to just run through quick. I don't think anybody's new here today, except for Stephan. We all know him. So if you don't mind, Eric, you're somewhere. I got a lot of faces on the screen. Thanks for everybody turning your camera on. Do you want to do a quick one on? We got to talk a little bit about ontologies. And then Brian will talk about.
May I run this one?
What?
May I run this one?
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say it's you, Eric, Adam, and then others if Courtney wants to say some things. So sure. We'll do our lightning round. Head out there, Brian.
First off, I had an announcement. Just wanted to let everyone know that the Direct Trust Information Exchange for Human Services consensus body that I reported on last week, we seem to have made some progress this week in our expectation that we will stand up two subgroups next week, one to explore human and social services provider discovery, and the other to explore social care information exchange and referrals. And just to reemphasize, this is not in competition with any of the work that we are also all doing within HL7 Human and Social Services Working Group, Directories Working Group, the Gravity Project Working Groups that so many of us are on, et cetera. We're making some progress within ICFIS as well. And then within our Unify, and I should also mention, just for Stephan's benefit, that ICFIS was formed because in a specific proof of concept demo that we were working on for Unify, we realized that while the work that we were doing in 360X around closed loop referral and in the clinical care SDOH IG for closed loop referral around SDOH information, that were great for dealing with referrals being exchanged within clinical care settings, EHRs, between EHRs and significant coordination platforms, even large human service providers, that they were a little too complicated for some of the small neighborhood community-based organizations that the single person home health aide and the accountant that does the taxes for the elderly, and neighborhood laundromats that deliver clean clothes. to the elderly. And so we were taking a look at, well, how can we solve this problem? And we brought that to some folks over at Direct Trust, and they said, yeah, we know how to solve that problem. So just to provide context for Stefan, that this is a big umbrella, big tent approach to solving all of these problems. Speaking of the proof of concept demos, and also the user story use cases work group. Last week, we reviewed the decarceration and reunification user stories that we submitted to the National Science Foundation for their Open Knowledge Network program. These programs included the need to define appropriate domain-specific ontologies, define cross-domain mappings, and implement cross-domain consent. Wanted to let folks know that the OKN workshop is going to kick off for this spring next week to refine the various use cases that have been proposed. And I think that at least Paul, Eric, and I will participate in those workshops as our schedules permit. I know I'm not going to be able to go to all 9 to 5 of them from Wednesday through Friday, but they're quite understanding of the fact that we also have other commitments. If these user stories survive the process of refinement, we should start planning for proof of concept demos of these user stories in the autumn, hopefully funded by NSF. So that's something for us to start planning on here. And kicking on to the education domain, I was invited to participate in the new Common Educational Data Standards Early Learning Working Group. My assigned subgroup was the organization subgroup, which frankly, from my point of view, was helpful in mapping the SEDS organization definitions to other domains directory information, as we're working on those definitions within healthcare and human services. But I'm also going to submit suggested requirements to the other working groups for early learning for chronic absenteeism, kindergarten readiness, and well, perhaps a bit presumptuous for early learning, 3rd grade reading level, because we know from New Jersey Inc., those are still areas of great interest to them, and unfortunately not data elements that are directly supported by SEDS at the moment. Adam, do you want to speak on our erstwhile child welfare domain?
Yeah, let me get back on camera here. Yeah, this will be very short. And some of you have heard it already because I gave the same update a few weeks ago and nothing has happened since. So we are still very much in formation. We have some good folks who want to be on the committee on this entity. And we think that it's an important one for all of us. I mean, if you want to talk about consent and information sharing, child welfare is where it doesn't happen. And making progress to make people feel secure that they can do this and that they can benefit from it, I think is really important. And I guess most of you know my background is in child welfare, and I'm a subject matter expert on the subject. So, you know, I care about it. I think that the work we're doing can be of genuine benefit, big time, to the field. So we're still working on to put it together. The piece that is slowing us down and that I'm in charge of. So of course it's slowing us down. Is we want to make sure that the table is full of genuine subject matter experts, people who understand the field, because if we make up some good technology that'll work functionally and doesn't deal with the realities of real day life on the ground, it's going to go nowhere. So I had one of my other hats is to head something called the National Center on Adoption and Permanency. And it's a consulting model, and I have a lot of really high-end folks on our team in policy and practice and in academia, etc. So I'm now talking to our committee chairs and board and individuals to get some of those folks on board. So we'll sort of have a pseudo partnership with NCAP, and that way we don't have to have just one or two. If we run into something, a question or a need for information, we won't have to go hunting around. We can stick with the organization and probably make some progress that way. So that's where we are. It's still organizing, and we will get there soon.
Adam, one quick thing I'm just putting into the chat
Yeah.
on a very related topic, and actually maybe later we can talk about this in the context. So ACF put out a technical bulletin. I shared it last week as well on data exchange, data standards in child welfare. So we're trying to make heads of or tails of it in terms of, because they mentioned NEEM, they mentioned fire, they mentioned other things like that. They put out another technical bulletin, a toolkit before that on CMS and child welfare, or Medicaid and child welfare data interaction. And so there's action happening there, standards talk, and obviously with our relationship with Inc. and trying to implement that, the more
Absolutely.
in sync we can be with Inc. around at least being able to point to the standards and the documents that are federally, and that's what everybody wants, right? They want federal, they want the feds to say what you can do. So anyway, that's there, and maybe we can actually encourage some of our ACF Children's Bureau people to come to one of our calls and
Oh, that
talk
would
about.
be cool.
Yeah, that might be good. Yeah, if we can find who actually wrote it, we're not quite sure. I interrogated Ken the other day; he didn't know either. So it's probably ICF International wrote it, but on the way.
Great. Courtney, do you want to make any comments from a U.S. aging perspective?
Thanks, Brian. Sorry, couldn't get my video to work there. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for indulging me in this environment. I know I tend to be, I like to call myself a unicorn in that I am very different, not necessarily special, because I do not have the technology background that you all have. Having said that, you know, I'm enjoying a very quick education. We're seeing across all of these different venues, certainly Direct Trust. I sit on the Gravity Strategic Advisory Council. This HL7, an important place for us to engage, to represent that CBO voice, as well as kind of the extra and different complicated reality we have as it relates to our network being funded under Older Americans Act, and having that unique data set that doesn't align with other things, that is part of the funded reality related to Older Americans Act. So we certainly have a lot of concerns, as I think I mentioned in previous meetings, across data sets, aligning across Gravity coded sets with our legacy data sets and those funding requirements, consent, interoperability between healthcare and the CBOs. And sometimes we see that's very healthcare centric. We're also seeing a lot of places where the CBOs have long histories of engagement, assessments, interventions, you know, data sets that are being reinvented by others in other spaces. So we're paying attention to that and trying to figure that out. Certainly, we're also paying attention to HIPAA. A lot of our folks very engaged in exchanging data on a HIPAA compliant level versus their need to exchange PI compliant data, and where all that plays out. And, you know, Brian and I spoke briefly. I think that it would be very responsible of us to advocate for an aging working group. Having said that, I want to manage expectations that, you know, we're drinking from a fire hose and trying to catch up with the rest of you all, as well as figure out what is the scope of work we should be looking at. So I guess this is the best way of saying, putting you guys on notice that I want to be able to come back and say, I think a working group is important, and figuring out what that should look like and who the players should be. We do have a group of agencies who are diving in. They're participating in Direct Trust. They've been involved in some gravity gap analysis and some work to really begin to understand where all of this connects and what are the big gaps as well as the problems trying to connect all of this up.
Yeah.
So that's as, I guess, transparent and honest as I can be in terms of where we are and our intent to try
know
and
you've
catch
been-
up.
You've been participating in the HL7, the new HL7 Human and Social Services Working Group as well. Did I see one of your AAA members there as well?
I think someone sat in and listened. I know there was somebody else on Direct Trust as well today, and we do have a couple that have joined Direct Trust. So, yes, Brian, what I was going to say is I have taken my skills of annoying people to another place, since I'm trying to play catch up and raising things that may frustrate you all, but we certainly appreciate being able to sit at the table and talk and learn, as well as try and create paths forward.
And forgive me, Courtney, you're not the only one drinking from a fire hose. I've been drinking from your fire hose and then not explaining the AAA reference. That stands for Area Agencies on Aging, correct?
Area Agencies on Aging, yes.
Okay, just wanted to explain that I suddenly had this facility for saying AAA that probably everybody else was saying, why are you talking about the American Automobile
Automobile
Association?
Association, exactly. No, thank you.
Eric, do you
Brian.
want to say something about ontologies?
Sure. I'll share my screen real quick here. On Friday, we've got our bi-monthly meeting for ontologies. We're going to go over the core ontology that we're working on to bind together just really high level the different areas of human services and how it may tie in with healthcare constructs. Also, we've got the Common Impact Data Standard ontology. We're going to be discussing how to go about getting it submitted as a W3C recommendation as a data standard. We're working on, we're going to discuss the NEAM conversion to ontologies. I've been working with the NTAC on that, and our use cases that we submitted to the NSF, the family reunification and the decarceration scenarios, also would involve these types of ontologies. And
For the NEAM justice domain and dealing with the prison in the user story, and for that
Right.
matter, family court.
So, for example, in NEAM, we ran a conversion. Actually, Dr. Renner at MITRE ran a conversion of the NEAM, what do you call it, schema standard to convert it from XML schema into the web ontology format, and look like this. So we did a little more work and got it to look like this, just going deeper into the ontologies and then linking up the different things. And it's all a scenario with somebody crashing a car and injuries and all, kind of an unhappy scenario. We should find a happier one. But anyway, here's the webpage for the common approach. Contact Amanda Taylor with Stewards of Change if you want to get invited to if you want an invite to the meeting. It's this Friday, 1 p.m. And you'll learn more about the process of Common Impact Data Standard becoming something more official. It's been being developed by the University of Toronto in connection with the Canadian government, and it's all about, if you're a funder, how do you show that you're having impact in the area that you're trying to affect. And so I think it's really exciting. Here's their ontology thrown up on the graph here. So anyway,
Is it in French?
it's not. I think it is translated, but yeah, this is not translated. So yeah, that's something we should ask tomorrow or Friday. Sorry. Thanks a lot. That's all I've got. And hit me up in the chat if you have any questions.
And finally, for the consent working groups, we know of multiple different state, county, CMMI efforts like the Integrated Care for Kids programs that are requiring common consent services to enable sharing of information between disparate information domains, such as obviously healthcare, social care, child welfare, education, justice, et cetera. And add to that, the tempo of work on the application of consent standards is picking up, both in those domains and within the standards bodies themselves. So I think the time has come for us to relaunch our consent governance and consent technology working groups to produce the consent blueprints or implement as agreements, as guides for these diverse efforts. So look forward to a doodle poll coming out from Amanda in the next few days for scheduling those meetings. And I'm done, Daniel, finally.
All right, thanks.
Oh my
Great
God,
day.
it took us 20 minutes, sorry.
Amanda, by the way, she's not here again this week because she's moving from Florida to somewhere in Virginia, and then the DoD changed where they were moving midway move. So they're sort of in limbo until they land on a base somewhere in Virginia. So
Yeah, they're a military family, just
Yeah,
to
yeah.
make it clear how that can happen.
yeah, right. Thank you for that clarification.
Having grown up in the Air Force, I understand.
I bet you a lot of people on the call have a common understanding of that there. Couple of thoughts. I want to just one quick thing, Courtney. There are these, when we talk more about consent and the different locations, New York, New Jersey, Colorado, maybe California now, there are older people living in all those places. And so as we're thinking about doing the consent, like we're all people with lived experience, and when it comes to consent, right? We all got to manage our consent. So think about it. Just making a suggestion about the fire hose. We're going to be able to sort of think about very deeply those use cases in those places, and how do you actually capture the consent. Area aging is probably there because there's probably a million. We know that the Bronx, and Paul, if you're on the line, yeah, you're here. Are there any old people in the Bronx?
Just a
Older.
few.
Yeah.
A few of us.
A few of us, right?
We had by the highest Medicare payment rate in the country.
Excellent. So Paul and Kathy are the sort of the go-to people for the Bronx work on the integrated care facility. And then Jennifer was on is in Colorado. So kind of interesting. So I want to just say, that's coming. So there's an immediate sort of on-ramp to that as it develops. I think with that, I wanted to just with the amount of work that's going on, it's pretty significant in terms of really trying to get our arms around healthcare, yes, and also all the other domains that Brian and company have sort of articulated for us, and how do we really connect the dots? And the consent work is obviously a critical part of that whole thing. And as I mentioned last time, we have some speaking engagements coming up. So as the Health Data Palooza, we're presenting with Mary and IOI and MELD and Pooja and PLCP, and who else am I forgetting? Just the three of us, right?
Just three
Yeah.
of us so far.
Right. Yeah, so far. And a bunch of folks will be at HIMSS. And then we just, as I said last time, just got invited to the European Social Network to present with Jim and Linux Foundation and stewards to present on consent in June internationally.
And Daniel, I've got a session at 5 now too.
Oh,
and they're
great.
kind of interop, showcase. And it looks like I just got word we might be doing a panel as well. So we're trying to pull that together with some folks. So if
That's great.
anyone's attending that, yep.
And Pooja, I'm obviously going to be at 5 with you, and then I'll be at HIMSS too. So
Yeah, yep.
So a lot of action going on, a lot of opportunity to at least be talking about this as well, which is wonderful. So I can continue to crow about that, but I think what I'd like to do is just kind of open up the floor. I mentioned to Stefan that we're interested in updates, FAST, LEAP, identity theft, SDOH. Obviously, we don't have that can take all day on some things, but just now that you've heard kind of where we're at on a couple of things and where we want to go, love to just turn it over and encourage people to sort of ask questions as they come up. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, so like you said, we got about 15 minutes left. I wasn't sure exactly how much time you wanted me to cover, so there's a lot.
Actually, we go longer. If you've got time, we go longer, so we can.
Okay.
We can take
Okay.
as much.
We rarely finish at 5. Really.
Okay.
There's usually
Right, well-
there's usually a double overtime. So, but we'll be kind.
Well, I'm in the central time zone, as you recall. So I'm in the
Perfect.
suburbs of Chicago. So for me, I usually work a little longer past that anyway. My colleague Whitney, who's on the call from ONC as well, who I'm sure many of you know. I think you might be. Are you Eastern, Whitney?
Yep, I'm in Baltimore. So
Yeah. So she might be hitting up against family dinner time. I don't know, like some of you, but. I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll just kind of hit a couple of the key topics that you mentioned and try to kind of connect the dots. I think that most of you on the call will be familiar with pretty much everything I'm going to cover at some level. And hopefully some of you had started to kind of connect the dots between these things as well. But if not, then, hopefully what I'm saying today won't be too redundant in what you've heard in the past. And if anything, will just kind of like help, again, just like get us all to the same, like, oh, wow, there's a lot of movement here. These things are interrelated, and there is some progress. And ultimately, it's pushing us closer and closer towards having to deal with, in a meaningful way, in a comprehensive way, this issue around consent, and specifically e-consent, right? So like from a technology approach. Obviously, we know that for a long time, many of us and others before us have been trying to think about consent and have been working on it. ONC has made investments in that space and have done a number of work in different areas, kind of small pockets. And you can think of our direct work on consent specifically, as well as other things that help support consent, like privacy notices, and to help with informed consent and other things like that. But there's been some transformative things that have been happening, dating back to the High Tech Act, the Cures Act. These things have multi-year implementations on them. They're extremely technical and complicated, but yet, again, given the way that the trends are going, it's all kind of coming to a head. So the first thing that I want to mention for a lot of you, and again, hopefully most of you are already aware of this, so apologies if you're like, yeah, I'm an expert, I'm already involved or whatever, is the Fire at Scale Task Force. And so I'm not going to share too many slides. I'm going to bounce around a lot to try to get through the stuff quickly. We could always have a follow-up in the future on some of these things. So first, this is from a recent presentation that FAST did at a Birds of Feather presentation at HL7. But just wanted to highlight the fact that it's something that had been going on for a number of years, looking at what it's going to take to deal with running fire-enabled solutions at scale. And so, high amount of transactions between a high number of different types of stakeholders, extremely diverse types of stakeholders, as we're looking to implement Cures Act and really kind of push the use of this kind of connected app ecosystem, patients being empowered to say, I want this app of my choice to go collect my data from this place and give it to that person and mediate the exchange of all that. And the Fire at Scale Task Force is trying to tackle that infrastructure issue. There's a lot of other accelerators out there that are looking at specific use cases. But the FAST initiative was really thinking about what's the common underlying architecture type of approaches that need to support all those other efforts, regardless of what that specific use case is. And so right now it's in that transition period. The first couple of years was really defining what the challenges and barriers to scalability were, identifying what those key kind of areas of infrastructure needs were, coming up with some proposed solutions. And then now they've moved towards actually taking those through a standardization process through HL7 and developing implementation guides and whatnot. So for that purpose, at this point, it's in the middle of transitioning to becoming its own accelerator to kind of manage the process of those implementation guide development, et cetera. So it's in that process right now. It will be coming an HL7 official kind of accelerator alongside many of the other ones that I heard Gravity mentioned a few times. I know a lot of you have been involved in some of these other groups as well. But again, think of these as the ones that are all running kind of these specific data for specific purposes, those individual use cases, Helios being that newest public health one. And FAST is being kind of like supporting what are those common scalability approaches that can enable all these things to just run at scale, right? And there's a lot of other efforts kind of trying to deal with some of these issues. But FAST is one that's kind of looking at a number of things like what is a common security approach? What is a common identity management approach? How do you deal with reliable routing between both intermediaries and without intermediaries? And again, not determining kind of who those actors are specifically, but doing it in a generalized way enough so that any actor can benefit from it. And I'm going to just you can see they're putting together the structure, the governance structure for that accelerator. But there's something that we had talked a lot about in the past with FAST when I used to lead that work was, basically a simple fire transaction. And this is just one example, but you could layer any other situation over here where you have a requester, somebody who's receiving that request and needs to respond to it, how they then process that and ultimately get the information back, depending on whatever that case is. But breaking down those technical steps along the way and where these different infrastructure use cases would kind of pop up along the way. Now, between identity and between security, those two Tiger teams and the solutions they came up with was always the issue of consent. And both of those Tiger teams consistently punted on this very challenging topic, saying, yeah, we got to deal with that, but we've got too much else to kind of handle with what we're focused on now. We'll come back to that later, or maybe we'll create that as its own kind of solution or as its own kind of work stream. But they stay focused on kind of like the core issue of security, recognizing that consent needs to be a piece of enabling that, and it's in the same for identity. So both of them kind of punted on it, and it was always kind of like put on the shelf for like, we'll come back to this. But the payers that were at the table through the Fire at Scale Task Force, the large provider institutions, and many others, all identified it as being kind of a key area of concern they didn't have a strong answer for, and that they knew that, especially as they started looking at things like granular consent, provenance of being able to track, consent after it's been initially given, and when to revoke, any kind of consent rights that were given. All of those types of things. There was just too many sticky issues, but they needed to get to them eventually. And that's something that's kind of concerning them, and so they see as a big risk as they start to open up their systems to sharing data through the things that are being mandated by the Cures Act. So I just wanted to highlight that and let everybody know that they should be following the FAST work. And if you're interested in joining it or being part of the accelerator, we can put you in touch with the teams leading it now. I think there was maybe one other thing here. I'm not going to share any more slides on FAST. But again, there's a lot of the stuff is all available online, and we can share these slides with you as well if you want to read through them and have a further deep dive on that. So that's the first thing. The second, yeah, go.
You go back up to the other slide you had. No, just go back to the other slide. You said there was a new group in there, and then there was also one of the questions I had there.
A new group.
On the slide, the one below that one, next one there. So you mentioned
Helios.
Helios.
Yeah. So this is the one, as you're familiar with, we announced the launch of this towards I think the end of last year, and essentially we're working with CDC to spin up a public health focused fire accelerator. So much like Da Vinci is focused on the relationship between payers and providers, to do things like prior authorization and, other things like that to help them both move towards value-based care. Gravity being focused on social determinants of health, Vulcan looking at, clinical research, Codex being on cancer, Karen being really focused on consumers. You can see the little icons here in the corners. I know it's not big. And then Argonaut, one of the earliest ones, or if not the earliest one, being focused more on provider to provider. The public health community has tried participating in a lot of these different efforts and haven't really found a home. And then in the Fire at Scale Task Force, they were part of that, and they definitely felt like there was a lot of certain specific needs that they had. And as ONC is co-leading some efforts nationally with the CDC to try to look at modernizing public health data infrastructure, and that includes health and human services and other avenues that live outside of the traditional private side of clinical care and whatnot. Project Helios, or the Helios Accelerator, is something that's being worked on, being launched in partnership with CDC. So ONC is helping CDC and HL7 put together and launch a fire accelerator specifically for public health use cases.
Cool. I just curious, Jim is Linux doing anything with that?
I'm a member of. I just recently joined the Helios group and started working with them. So I haven't gotten plugged in, but yeah, my grander scheme is Linux Foundation Public Health is looking at an open source public health data sharing hub. And so to the extent to which we can look at data standardization and apply a fire standard as part of that, of course, would be advantageous.
Yeah, and that's exactly what this will be focused on. And it is still very early in the process. So just know that you're not too late to the game. And for anybody else, it's just getting spun up. They're very early and kind of just figuring out, their charter and what their governance structure and all that.
I'm not even sure we have a meeting scheduled yet. So
yeah.
Can I just throw one little thought into there for you guys who are working on Helios to think about? I just learned about it the other day and starting to talk to our City Department of Health folks about whether they might be participating. But the biggest challenge that our City Department of Health has is their own bureaus can't talk to each other. They have completely separate registries. They have completely separate data systems. They have no MPI. So they can have New Yorkers who are in 4 different public health registries, and none of those folks know who the other one's managing. So maybe some focus on some internal use cases within an agency where fire might actually help their disparate systems talk to each other without their having to invest in a complete new comprehensive system. Might be something to think about.
You're exactly right, Kathy. And the
it's
intent
not a traditional fire application, but boy, would it help them.
Yeah, the intent of our pilot is it would serve at 1 or more locations to facilitate that exchange, even if it was between agency system to agency system. So the intent is not to force them to put in a bunch of new plumbing, but to leverage what's already out there in a lot of ways that's transmitting data that isn't in a synchronized fashion, and to your point, can't talk to one another. And I mean, I was on a conversation yesterday where, just the cases where the epidemiology side of the Department of Health office isn't talking to the Medicaid office side. So wouldn't Medicaid like to know what's going on from a COVID response type side, and they're not even sharing data. So it's kind of hoped to be a way, particularly as an open source solution offered in partnership with the states, to broker some of that data exchange architecturally to address what are really policy problems first and foremost.
But I want to make a big point here, and I keep making it on a regular basis, but this is really showing what I would say is that consent is actually a public health utility, even though it is oftentimes used for private information exchange.
I personally agree with you, Paul, which is why I hang out with you great folks, because it's a public health, population health level issue first, in my opinion.
And human services as well.
Yes, and human services.
I had a question about.
Oh, wait, before maybe we should. I'm sorry to cut you off, Matt. I want to just see where we're at on time.
And I'm okay to go a little long.
Okay, good.
If others are.
Matt, I'm sorry, do you want to just?
Sure.
You got a quick question, and then we'll run through and then open it up later as well.
So I guess my question is about where you see work around consent going, and maybe as it relates to obviously the 21st Century Cures Act points to fire as kind of the go-to standard, and then TEFCA comes along with their plan, and in short they point to a bunch of IHE profiles, and they have a roadmap to maybe supporting fire in the future, but they also have not kind of specified how they're going to handle consent and person matching and all these other things. So anyways, where do you see are the kind of the lower hanging fruits when it comes to consent and fire and TEFCA?
Yeah, that's actually a great transition to the next thing I was going to cover, which was TEFCA. So just to mention that some of these groups individually have been trying to tackle it, through their efforts, and they're referencing consent in different ways in their existing accelerators. Again, this is all fire focused, and we know that there's consent beyond just the fire use case. But like we know Karen is working on some stuff related to that. The FAST members have all kind of like tried to come to terms around something, but like I said before, that's work that they had kind of tabled and said we need to come back to this. We know it's a big issue, but it's also kind of like one of those big thorny issues where they're like, we know it's a problem, we've acknowledged that, we don't know where to start. And so like it just kind of keeps getting kicked down the road. One of the things that ONC is looking to do is host a workshop this year. We were trying to host it at the end of last year, and then it got delayed with the holidays, and then for a number of other reasons, it's been pushed back a little bit further. So, but we are still actively working on trying to plan that. We hope to include all of you, Project Unify, and a couple of the other organizations that we're aware of that are trying to work on some kind of common approaches to deal with consent, and having some common models for it, to kind of share that with a broader community, kind of bring everybody to the table like we like to do, and then to try to kind of work through some of those thorny issues. So the workshops are great for that, but that is one thing that we're hoping to evolve to here. And we'll be, recruiting and getting, people from these different accelerators to participate, point of care partners. We've done some work with them before. Much like you saw, one things that we asked them to do when we were going through the FAST project, as we were trying to scope out future work, potentially being focused on consent, is we thought about this transaction model, right? Just looking purely at an electronic transaction in a fire scenario, and then identifying in here, where does consent come up? We know some of the general places it comes up, but maybe re-engineering a flow chart like this to just be focused on kind of common consent requests, approval process and whatnot, kind of mapping that out. And I know we had worked with point of care partners. I don't think anything was ready for public consumption because we was kind of like, a deliverable that was still in process, but we'd worked on kind of scoping some of this out. We did it also with input from some others that are trying to address this through the HL7 working groups as well. So things like that are something that we like to hope to get to, and just look at it purely from a technical architecture standpoint, and then thinking through like, what are the common ways this pops up in all these other different use cases, and then try to tackle it from that. When it comes to TEFCA, in a abrupt kind of segue to TEFCA, I hope all of you read the blog post we put out earlier this year. Let's see if I can pull that up. Just give me a second. So on our website at healthit.gov, we've got our TEFCA page. I'm sure all of you have been here, and there's a lot on there. But if you look here, we do link on this page this Health IT blog post and a press release that went along with it from earlier this year. And in that, I'll just kind of click on this so you can see. They do a good job of explaining kind of like, where things are at, how we got to where we are, the main focuses of TEFCA. If you're not familiar with it, I think most of you have been tracking it, but what we're trying to get to with this nationwide kind of trust framework for exchange, and the role that the RCE plays, Sequoia project in doing this for us and certifying those QNs. They released the technical framework, which starts to lay kind of like, what is some of the governance around this? And then they put in here a TEFCA fire roadmap, which this fire roadmap is a starting point for like how to consider we're going to be able to fold fire into TEFCA. And Matt, I heard you mention that you're aware of that, so I'm glad to hear you're tracking that.
Yeah.
One thing that might be a little harder to notice, it was initially a little bit more visually called out, and then it kind of got softened a little bit, is the references to the fire at scale task force solutions. So some of the things in the fire roadmap, and I think there's a very soft mention of it. I'm trying to remember where it is. Here it is. So it's basically saying that one of the things they're going to be doing is looking to efforts that are out there where there's implementation guides in process or in place around things like the security protocols, where FAST is proposing primarily a UDAP approach around identity practices or whatever, or the exchange one. And then considering that and as a model that then they might need to be able to make a requirement ultimately for participating in the network. So as of right now, the problem with us calling that out specifically and saying we definitely will do that is that they're still in the ballot process, right? And so those IGs aren't quite through it, so it's hard to reference something before it's officially kind of cleared the balloting process and gets to a kind of a more of a normative state. But that's just something that I wanted to highlight, is that what they're looking at is like, here are some scalable models that are being worked on, and we may ultimately look to things like that to incorporate as requirements in this. Consent is one that hasn't been worked on yet. So they are looking to, other examples, at least through Fire Scale Task Force. But we know that there are other efforts out there, including the ones that you guys are working on, where we hope to surface these things and then eventually have Sequoia evaluate and work them into as part of their fire roadmap. So consent is a key piece of that, obviously. So that's just something I wanted to kind of call out as far as the touch point with TEFCA. I got to be careful what I say about TEFCA because a lot of it's still kind of in place. The best place to go for that is the
Boo.
Sequoia team. Sorry.
Boo. How you doing? Annie.
Background noise.
Annie.
So
No worries. And then Matt says, am I missing something, or was that?
So that was in reference to my earlier comment. So fire is obviously, point to point, you wherever you're sending or accessing the data, right? Whereas TEFCA kind of defines QHINs as the intermediary. So my question was, am I missing something about them not being kind of going in different directions?
Yeah, so actually, if you a good place to start to kind of address some of that is if you look at the exchange solution being worked on by FAST, it talks about reliable routing through intermediaries as well as without intermediaries, and how can you kind of track that, and it's got kind of a model for it. TEFCA and the QHINs might play a role as being one of those intermediaries. It may also be able to play a role in helping kind of track in assuring and kind of validating that routing and stuff. Who knows? There could be a couple of options there. But so the QHINs, there's the number of options of what they can be and what they can serve, not just as part of being the network, but also being that endpoint, if you will, right? So fire isn't just necessarily one small stakeholder to another small stakeholder. It could be any fire endpoint to another fire endpoint, which there's also a directory solution that talks about kind of a national healthcare directory that includes things like fire endpoints and how do you manage that in a federated model, which builds on a whole history of work that's been out there before. I'm sure many of you have been involved in it.
Stefan, Jim has his hand up.
I do, and I'll only pick on you for a minute, Stefan, but you have to be the designated ONC representative here talking about TEFCA. And it's a follow-on to Matt's question, which is the TEFCA exchange documents as drafted right now don't include any documentation around the testing requirements, the end-to-end testing and provenance and validation of transactions. And so to Matt's point, where fire is kind of crafted around point to point, and this is, to use an older term, kind of multicast. And I realize TEFCA isn't entirely in your bailiwick right now, but where do you see testing going? Realizing I won't speak their name. There's really only one commercial company I know of that does end-to-end fire testing, but it should be something to be considered and built in, I think.
Yeah, there's a testing and certification Tiger team under the Fire Skill Task Force, and they've had some conversations about how to support the testing side of things, and that's just another example of something that we hope that TEFCA, specifically the RCE and the TEFCA network would kind of take into consideration. So we know that that's an ongoing need for these things. You're right. I shouldn't, even if I could get into detail, I shouldn't talk more about these things. We have a team that's very careful about what they can and can't say. What I would recommend, and I hate to punt on this specific question because it is a good one, but in this blog post that I highlighted, there's a little button here for webinars. There's a lot of hyperlinks in here, but if you click on that, there's a number of upcoming sessions and Q&A opportunities, common agreement Q&As that's coming up on the 22nd, just next week. There's a technical framework and fire roadmap QA, March 1st. So these are some good places to go ahead and register and propose those questions. And then they'll be able to give you the most appropriate responses that we can at that time. There's a couple of other ones. There's a workshop for people who are considering being a QHIN or others who might want to, work with QHINs and get them involved. And again, another one, some other opportunities for that. You could also get on this series of monthly informational calls. It's a good place to kind of track the stuff and raise some of those if they have open question parts. So if you haven't already, you can register for the whole series just by kind of clicking that button there. And you can see the past presentations and recordings to get some updates on some of those things that have come up. So I definitely encourage you, if you want to dive deep into TEFCA and ask those very valid questions, I'd recommend kind of going to this link here, which is provided by the RCE, I believe. I think Sequoia's put that up there. And again, I'll tell you what, if you want,
Can you drop that link in?
Yeah, I will go ahead and just drop that in to make it.
Thanks.
Thank you much, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I wanted to mention is real quick, because I know we're a little bit out of time. Is Whitney still with us?
Good. We're good. We're good as long as you're good.
Let me see if Whitney was able to stay on or not.
Yep, I'm here.
Yes. Okay, great. Is that there's obviously an intersection. We have an ever growing portfolio around SDOH. of work. Whitney and I both participate in an internal work group that we have, an SDOH work group. In fact, they had a call, was it yesterday morning or this morning? My days are blurring. Where we kind of just organize around, how we as an organization are going to be able to, the different ways we can advance the work in the SDOH space. And this includes our work around USCDI and, getting that incorporated into version 2, as well as, a couple of other places. It's even come up on health equity and equity by design in our AI bias conversations. So SDOH plays a good, key role in a lot of areas, and consent's another one of those. So one of the things I wanted to do is have Whitney talk a little bit about, we have a number of, and Whitney, if you want, I can go ahead and just pull up the SDOH page on our website, but we have a number of resources for those who aren't aware on SDOH, and she could talk a little bit about those as well. Let me go ahead and pull that up while you start, Whitney.
Sure, yes. So I think I've mentioned it before to the group. I did want to just keep it on the radar that we do have a social determinants of health information exchange toolkit that will be released at some point. We don't have a release date yet. So yes, using it once again, but stay tuned for more information there. And that is focused on social determinants of health information exchange in communities, and in particular, some key non-technical considerations for those efforts. So things like involvement of the community, having the vision and mission, finance, policy, et cetera. So the key piece is to get an effort started, especially when we're talking about cross-sector information sharing in communities. So yes, we have our website here. And so down below is HHS and SDOH resources, but if you go up, Stefan, we do have some links to some of the workshops that we've had in the past, as well as some of our LEAP grants, explaining those efforts and standards as well, including USCDI, the Federal Health IT Strategic Plan. And yeah, so there's a number of links here and references available. But yeah, do stay tuned for additional developments. But yeah.
Yeah, and did we already update the Health IT playbook with the SDOH page, the updated SDOH page, or is that part of the rollout with the toolkit when that comes out?
I believe so, yes, because that's focused on healthcare, so they are kind of separate. Yeah, but.
Yeah, so I see Paul has a question too. Has there been any coordination with CMMI about SDOH and reporting? So it's a big issue for the industry. I'm guessing that's what the IN is.
I believe so, but yeah, I need to get more information.
Yeah, for the Inc. projects. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the major, Kathy can tell you, this is one of the major topical areas of how to exchange information.
Yeah, and I can talk about I can elaborate on
Thanks,
that. Maybe
Keela.
you guys have some insight. So there's a couple of ways in which SDOH data, like boots on the ground, can be exchanged today. And then there's some really clear shortcomings of those options. So one, of course, is using Z codes, except for social services organizations, they're often not staff that are used to coding data. So Z codes is not something that's in their wheelhouse. The other option is around SNOMED codes, but that would require that you map their internal assessments to SNOMED codes. Again, we're talking about vendors that would have to take on that initiative, and they're not volunteering to do that. And then I think the third option is to just go with key value paired data, question and answers in various assessments. And what we've seen happening and why this is so challenging is people are saying, okay, well, I'll take the idea of prepare as a screening tool, and then I'm just going to customize it. And so everybody's customized it to be valid to them. And now we're all stuck with, well, there's no common SDOH screening tool because everybody's made it their own flavor. They took concepts, but that was it. And again, that's all unstructured text question and answer data. So when we talk about how do we move this forward, I think there's a multi-pronged approach that makes sense at different organizations, but how do we really drive to some standardization around that? Because if they, you could ask the same question two different ways and a yes to one answer, as an answer in one question format and a yes on the other could be exact opposites. So just looking at the answers to similar questions isn't really going to be good enough. We're going to have to analyze like the intent of the question, and is yes a positive answer or a negative answer. So it's quite complicated, and I don't know where, and I think we're all sort of waiting for the shoe to drop on where is the standardization and how are we going to drive implementation of those standardizations. And I'm sorry if I just went on a soapbox about that.
Well, and I'll dive in here. I mean, our network has been doing a lot of assessments for 45 plus years. They may use Prepare, but they use things that are much more expansive and intensive than Prepare, which they need to do for the person-centered care they do. So achieving that standardization, yeah, that's a real challenge. And to add to that challenge, because of the Older Americans Act funding, which our network, you know, we sit on top of that foundation. You know, some of those assessments could vary from state to state. So you're dealing with rolling all of this out on top of a network foundation that is structurally, you know, the architecture for that is different than what everybody wants to drop on top of it. So I have a lot of concerns about that, as well as concerns that this work is ongoing and there's all different entities now trying to create standardization around what's working on the ground.
I would just
That's why we have Brian.
I would make one more point, which is that this is all great. And then we need to talk about the data transmission and like a V3 message. Where do you put the SDOH data in a meaningful, discrete way? I haven't found a good home for it. I think FHIR has more potential, but again, it goes into the like, well, which framework are we really backing on the short term? So it's not just a matter of collecting the data, how is it being coded, but then where does it go and how does it get transmitted from one site to another or to an HIE, for example?
And Brian,
Yeah.
Is that ICFIS connectivity there, potentially?
Repeat the question.
Kayla, why don't, I'm looking at, she's talking about the transmission of that information.
Yeah, I'm just saying that SDOH data in general, like we've talked about, you can do Z codes, you can do SNOMED codes, you can do question and answer, like text key value pairs, but how and standardly how these are going to be transmitted between data partners, right? As somebody who's actively working on transmitting and aggregating SDOH data, it's not standard. It doesn't have a home in a CCD really. It doesn't, FHIR's not widely implemented, nor has that been wholly defined from a use case perspective. And so we're going a non-standard. We're going through flat files. I mean, that's not sustainable long-term. So then where does that go? And where do we see driving toward more implementation of a standard there?
The New Jersey Inc. Grant is actually coding their assessments and
to SNOMED?
Storing SNOMED, whatever, OCD-10, is it OCD-10?
ICD-10.
ICD-10 would be Z codes, yeah.
And so, you know, in FHIR, you don't really need Z codes per se, but I suppose you could use them. At any rate, so they've done several assessments up there, one of which is the Prepare, and they are all stored in FHIR. So, you know, if you want to make a connection up there, you know, guy's name's Mike Relly. So, you know, he would be able to talk to what they're doing up there. And they
Yeah,
have
just to clarify, it's not a Z code and is not a Z segment in HL7V2. A Z code is a family of the family of ICD codes. So they would have a home and FHIR. It would be a diagnosis section or a social history section. But if they're not coded, right? If you're talking about a social services agency who doesn't code data because that's not the world that they live in, then Z codes don't work for them. If you're talking about, people who have post coding happening and are used to coding and billing that way, then great, that makes a lot of sense. But I think we're also short circuiting who's actually on the ground working and collecting SDOH data. It's not the people who are used to coding. It's not physicians. They don't have post-coding systems in place. And that's who we need to be solving for.
So the people that are building the
Thank you.
in New Jersey Inc. are MDs and informaticists. So they should have some awareness of what you're talking about. And it'd be good to connect to them to get under the covers to see, exactly what they're doing and how
And I
that
think
works.
the HIEs could play a role here, right? In saying, okay, well, give me your text answers and you give me your text answers and we'll figure out how to standardize it for you and code it, right? That's an option, but it's just very complicated because of the language nuances and how they're written the question. And I don't know that that's a survivable, extensible solution.
Well, I guarantee you it's not.
Yeah,
So-
I was gonna say, Rita, I know had some. If you're not looking at the chat, Rita had some good comments. Rita, you want to expand? Because as usual, I think Rita's got a good point to make here.
Thanks, Stephen. No, I just want to basically second everything that I've heard Keela emphasize with regards to the complexities around screening and how there are assumptions sometimes made around what codes are really useful versus not, and who really actually makes use of those codes. So Keela, I am right there with you because I also observed that in the experience that I had last year. So
I'm sure that Courtney would agree.
I'm nodding my head.
And these are examples of things that we're hoping, and I mentioned this to Daniel before. So as we look to have this consent workshop in the future, we want to set like an agenda up, and we want to have an external planning committee that includes folks like yourself to help identify what are those thorny issues that we still need to kind of tackle, and some of these key considerations that we need to address. So those are some of the things we'll hope that we're taking notes now, but also we're going to think through, like, if ONC hosted a workshop, which we're going to, what are the key things that we think we need to be addressed and that we need to kind of like raise awareness about and try to work together on. It's a workshop, not a showcase. The AI showcase was nice. This is going to be a little bit of show, but enough just to spark the conversation in the workshop, right? So we'll do a little bit of show and tell of like things that you guys are doing, the things that others are doing, but then the bulk of the time is really going to be kind of like breaking out and diving into these deep issues. And then we could have a good summary report that comes out after that. So hoping that you kind of continue to think about things like this that need to be identified. ONC knows that, although we're doing some good things around this, we've been working through US core data for interoperability through US CDI to establish some of those data standards for SDOH related data elements. You're absolutely right. There needs to be exchange standards as well. And we think that, Gravity is starting to tackle some of those, right? And they're coming up with some implementation guides potentially and things, they're looking at different use cases, but we also know that that's not catching everything, right? There's still a lot of needs for standardization work, for policy work that's to support it all, incentives, the whole implementation adoption. Even if you have all that stuff, how do you actually get people to pick it up and use it, right? That's always the kind of big question mark whenever it comes to any of this stuff. So, FAST is going through that and has talked about it since day one. We can come up with a standard security approach. We can come up with all these things. How are we going to, get people to actually all adopt it universally? And so they've had some ideas on how to do that. And we're, trying to see if TEFCA is one of those avenues where you can help encourage adoption by saying, hey, if you're going to participate in this network, you have to, be using these types of approaches. And there's other things we can do through the certification program sometimes, where you can make a part of certification potentially. That has its own process. But there's always laggards, and there's always, like, how do you get down to these groups? And a lot of times it's not because they don't want to, it's either because they don't know how to, or they don't have the capacity, they don't have the skill set. Like Keela was saying, sometimes, they're just not using it. That's not their world. They don't work with it, right? And so those are always the challenges, when we get down to it, is, how do you ultimately, but if you don't have it developed first, then there's nothing for them to implement. So you have to kind of figure that out first. And then while you're doing that, think through, like, how do you actually get them to pick it up and run with it? So,
and a lot of that, a lot of that's going to be throwing money at systems and at worker retraining, because it's
Yeah.
going to change workflows and what staff do and how they do it for people who have never ever had to deal with many of these things in these ways that we're talking about.
Well,
And we need to help them, move from the, previous dinosaur age into the 21st century, right? We can't just expect them to be able to do it on their own.
And Ken, it's not, I mean, we've been here before, right? 2008,
Yep.
we knew what it was like. Less than 10% of people had electronic information. It was all paper manila folders, right? And as we were incentivizing the adoption of electronic health records, and especially on the private side of healthcare, I think it was a big mistake that we didn't focus enough on the public side of healthcare, but that's another conversation for another day. Daniel and I used to talk about that, years ago, like how they're just two separate parallel paths, with the public side of healthcare and human services lagging behind because the incentives just weren't there for them to adopt all this. But as we did that, they bucked it. They had to learn, retrain, workflows, all of that, and it was messy. It still is messy.
Yep.
Provider
Still
burden
is
is a real
messy.
issue. Provider burden is still a real issue, and it's just one of those
Exactly.
things. But you ask any physician, would you want, what if we shut down the electronic health records tomorrow and let you go back to paper? Almost universally, most of them would say, hell no. Are you crazy? So it's growing pains, but yeah.
It's just an electronic version of a paper document at this point in time.
Yeah.
So we still have a long way to go. And that's the problem, right?
And I think to Mary Sarah's point, it was that we made one solution and just applied it universally. So all these EMRs that are in the behavioral health social services sphere have only the clinical healthcare protocols to follow. There is nothing for them. And they say, well, that doesn't really apply to us, but we'll figure out, we've made it work in the frameworks that we've been given. And so I think Mary Sarah's, has a point, which is it wasn't part of health at the time that it was defined and developed, right? The definition and scope of what is healthcare has expanded, and yet we have not bothered to expand the standards with it.
And so much of what drove
user-centered design, right? It also comes back to that.
So much of what drove the healthcare data standards was billing.
Right.
You don't get paid unless you use the code.
Exactly.
And that reimbursement framework doesn't exist in any of the other social or educational or other areas that we're talking about. They don't have the incentive to code it right, or you're not going to get your money.
Well, and Kathy, to take that a little bit further, I think you're exactly right. I think that coding piece is such an important trigger. And all of the conversations I've been in to date about the social determinants of health coding are focused on the healthcare providers coding for social determinants of health. They're not focused on how to empower CBOs and social service organizations to code, nor are they discussing how those codes are going to be funded. Want to manage everybody's expectation is that I don't hear anybody talking about a major infusion of capital to help with the realities related to the IT deficiencies sitting on the ground for CBOs. To give you guys a snapshot, we're 620 area agencies on aging. They all have computers and IT. 220 Title VI Native American aging programs. Most of them have computers and IT. They contract over 18,000 local aging service providers. I'm sure one of them sits across this state that barely has a computer. So these are the folks you're talking about stepping up to fire standards. When you say fire, they're thinking they should run out of their house. They're not talking about, aligning in terms of their data. So I would suggest to you what you all went from a healthcare alignment back in 2008, 2010, and with the infusion of finances you had, I'm not hearing or seeing anything that equates to that. And I'm also not hearing on the integration piece. It's all healthcare centric, not CBO centric on social determinants of health. Yet the very people that have to provide these services are the ones that have been doing it for 45, 50 years. And it feels like everybody is creating all of this around them without them. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that have to provide the service. So I've got some real concerns about some of the disconnects in the landscape.
Yep, but we're trying.
And I'd add, Courtney, that what happens is in the gap, it gets pushed to the provider to fill that information in. So, nothing against the fine folks at Gravity, but to your point, it's more coding and data exchange from a clinical provider perspective, where the provider is filling in the gaps that in integration with a properly equipped CBO would be able to provide that information.
Well, exactly, Jim. And I'll tell you, one of my big concerns is you're now talking healthcare providers going out and finding somebody to do that SDOH assessment and work. Typically, chances are great it's not going to be a top of the licensed person. They're going to have someone who they're not maximizing top of the license. And guess what? They're not an expert at dealing with SDOH. Why aren't we looking at SDOH providers as their own expertise? And a physician's office wouldn't suddenly take on the role of a radiologist. I mean, why aren't you referring to the experts on SDOH? They've been doing it for 45 to 50 years.
Well, it's 5:30 and I'll go off the rails and say, why aren't we combining all of that as public health, population health driven information that elevates and floats all boats with regards to overall level of healthcare before coming into any one particular care instance or encounter?
Or if we're Medicare, our Advantage Part D, we are reimbursing assessment of social determinants of health for clinical providers. Why are we not reimbursing the human service organizations that are actually delivering the services?
Exactly.
So let me say we are officially in this double overtime. So for those of you who do want to jump, feel free. You're allowed to go. No shame. But if it sounds like the conversation is still fertile. So if people want to stay on, and Stefan, if you want to hang for a longer, you're welcome. This is really the crux of the matter. And Courtney, this has been in many ways our mantra, which has been to demedicalize SDOH for years. As it's changing that frame of reference. It's embedded. It's just so embedded that it's a big lift, especially since that's where all the money is. So aside from renaming the agency the Department of Human Services and delete the health out of HHS and just call it Human Services, level the playing field in a way. I mean, I say that in jest, but in a way, health always ends up at the center of the plate. Even in the data, I mean, the stuff we're talking about here, it's like, does your doc really need your SDOH data? Are they really going to do anything with it? Do they really even know what to do if they did? Do they have the resources to refer it out? No. Now they can bill for it. We're getting it. What happened? It's the social services folks, the people coming out of jail, and all that whole side of the equation needs a few pieces of data from health, right? So it's how does health enable that flow of information? I'm preaching the converted here, Courtney, in a way that is easy. You don't get a 25 or 50 or 100 page CDA, right? You just need a couple pieces of information that may be very different for everybody you're serving. So that is the question, and that's why we said even last week the parallel between aging and children is so close because of that level of engagement, that level of care that's needed, and the frailty of the information systems that need to support that. So one of the things I wanted to just share, one of the things that struck me, and we heard from Anita Friedman, who's the director of the Department of Health and Human Services in Arlington County, Virginia. She spoke about their integrated 2-page universal consent a couple months ago. 2 pages, right? Same kind of thing, a couple other places across the country. And they have had success with it. They've got a lot of success with it. It took 5 years to get that through their legal approval process in both the county, in Fairfax, in Arlington, and then at the state level, because they were dealing with state and local government. the thing, and so it's a beautiful thing to look at. And I've been talking with her because she's one of the Kresge sites as well that's been trying to figure out how to do interoperability, along with Hennepin County, Alameda County, a couple other, Montgomery County, and Sacramento, not Sacramento, yeah, Sacramento County. Anyway, the way they're successful at actually getting consent is because of their community health workers. But they are in the community. They have been in the community. They know people before they touch the public system. So they walk in with a warm hand, literally, physically warm hand, and a piece of paper, right? So that creates the trust framework. That's why I think that whatever that terminology is around zero trust is a bad name for space. But so when they actually come into contact with the social services or a CBO, it's through that kind of person. They provide their consent. They want us to share their information, please. And don't ask me for it again 25 times if you don't mind, right? That's a message that reverberates in every community, every county that I've ever worked with over the last 15 years. So it's a technological answer that needs to be brought. It's got to be, I'll just say, sort of that Amazon experience when you go to buy something, or just sophisticated online retailers. That was the original vision of the exchanges, right? Was to make it modern. So Stefan, I'm interested in, where's the vision work? I mean, this is all amazing work, and the stuff at scale is big, but is ONC having those vision conversations with ACF and CMMI and CMS, and are those cross-agency conversations happening at all? And if so, should we be hopeful?
Yeah, they're popping up in a couple of different places. Am I off of mute? Okay, good. I actually dropped 2 links into the chat. I don't know if folks have seen them, but they're relative to something we're working on with the White House and the Office of Science and Technology policy. So there was a couple executive orders that were issued under the Biden administration around health equity and community healthcare initiatives and so on. And we're helping them specifically. We helped them draft and put out an RFI that I dropped the link into. I think it's only open for another like 10 or 12 days about technology in communities, to help kind of support community health workers specifically as well. And so, it's a pretty big question they ask. It's pretty broad, so it can allow a lot of people to kind of answer. It's not real refined, unfortunately. But they also launched a number of a 3-part kind of webinar series or kind of roundtable events. Tomorrow is the second in that series of 3. Which is going to be focusing on financing models to support CHWs, not just from a workforce perspective, but also from a technology support perspective. So how do you, incentivize and subsidize, making technology investments that can support community healthcare workers and other professions like that are actually delivering care in these community-based settings and such. And some of that is around specifically what it takes to develop the technology and some of the technology needs for that. I'll be leading one of the breakout sessions. That's a closed event on that tomorrow afternoon. And then there's another one that's coming up. The third roundtable is more on like kind of global community health. So it's not quite as relevant to our conversation. But that's one place where there's HRSA is involved in co-leading that effort with the White House. ONC is involved in supporting it. Many other federal agencies. Kelly Cronin, who I know many of you have met before in the past from ACL, is part of that as well. She'll be co-moderating with me tomorrow. And then also through a couple of other efforts where there's some interagency work groups, and I'm trying to remember the exact name for that, but they're focused more on kind of public health modernization. Most of it was kind of geared up with funding and kind of a call to action around the pandemic response, knowing that there was a lot of inequities that happened with how we address the pandemic in certain communities in underserved populations. And so that work has spurned this whole, like, we need, greater interoperability between the public, human, community side of healthcare and the private side of healthcare. There needs to be, more kind of solutions that are developed with and for the populations that historically are left behind and don't have those kind of solutions developed for them. Through Pandemic X, which is another initiative I led, where we've got it's in a startup accelerator focused on addressing the pandemic. we baked into that, health equity considerations and the 15 startups who got into that accelerator. One of them actually is developing technology specifically for use by CHWs. Cultural Care Collective, I think it is. If some of you have heard of Cynthia Rufo and her startup, but they are specifically all asked, how are they either designing their solution to deal with the pandemic in a way that either takes into considerations the potential it could have for inequitable impacts, and to make sure that they're mitigating that potential, or for addressing specific populations that typically are left behind. So how is it making sure that their solution is designed to service a population that typically doesn't have a technological solution available to them. So there's a lot of different ways we're working with other agencies on this, and certainly there's an SDOH. Whitney, you might know the exact title of it, but there's an SDOH like council or work group or something like that, an interagency work group that's just focused on SDOH. There's one that's focused on health equity. They all talk about a lot of the same things. So it certainly is coming up in a lot of different places between the agencies. Publicly, though, there's only a few places where you see it. A lot of it's still kind of behind the scenes coordination, and ONC is involved in many of those. Specifically, even Miki Tripathi, our current national coordinator, who is very big on these topics. He sees health equity as being one of his kind of key areas that he wants to stake a flag on the ground on, and say he made an impact as national coordinator on kind of like driving greater health equity by design through health IT. And he sees SDOH, and he sees some of these issues around that community care, transition to value-based care, and servicing those communities alongside. He sees that as being like key elements to a successful approach for that. Whitney, anything you want to add? I know there's a lot going on, so I probably did miss a few other key initiatives, but I just want to flag some of those.
Yeah, that's most of it, I think, from what I can remember. But yes, there's a lot of discussions happening behind the scenes. And continue to go to the website for the public release. So yes, we are coordinating across HHS.
If you asked ONC a few years ago, what was our stance on SDOH? We weren't prepared to give an answer on it.
Right.
We would say, "Oh, we've done this work."
We didn't have the term a few years ago.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I came to ONC in 2015, and we definitely had people who were working on it then. And I was well aware of it. And I definitely knew the term because I came from the Illinois Department of Public Health, where on the public health side, we certainly have known the term for a long time. We'd been working on SDOH initiatives for years when I was in public health. But yeah, no, there's a lot of people at ONC who have a public health background, who are actually, in a position that we have at ONC called a public health analyst, and have an MPH behind them, and certainly are familiar with the concepts of social determinants of health and how they play in, and have been fighting to try to get that, considered more in some of these initiatives that we have. But as far as putting it together as part of like a portfolio of work and developing and organizing an internal kind of work group on it, that's more in the last 2 years where we really started to get organized around it. And part of that is because of the momentum outside of federal government. It's been happening in the industry where people are starting to realize, like we need to focus on this more. The talk in the last 3 to 5 years around transitions to value-based care has forced a lot of that as well. If you go back to the ACA and the requirements for community health needs assessments, a lot of hospitals and all had no idea where to begin and how to start getting that kind of information, and how to work out and reach with community-based organizations and local public health departments who are already doing such needs assessments and had a lot of that data. So they started, to try to figure out how we're going to collaborate with them to start thinking this way. But there still is a ton of work to be done to make that something that's actually, structured and effective, because it is still a lot of just conversations at this point, right?
Well, and Stefan, yeah, back during the Affordable Care Act, certainly the care transitions work, those CMS awards that moved, I think there were 120 sites on care transitions work, with some of that early work, that we saw.
CCG grants, community transformation grants. Yeah. We were an award recipient in Illinois. Yeah.
Yep. So, but I will tell you all regarding social determinants of health, I feel like an old woman. I mean, because our networks have been doing it forever, and they feel kind of vogue now. They've finally come into vogue because this is what they've done, and they've been looking for this moment where they could bridge to healthcare and have that appropriate conversation and handoff and communication with healthcare, because we know that all day long, healthcare systems, providers can treat patients, but when they go home, the patient, the client has every opportunity not to make headway, not to adhere to care plan. They don't have fresh fruits and vegetables. They don't understand the care plan. There's a lot that can go wrong where we can support the system and make it better, save money, drive better outcomes, or not. So it's exciting to me that there's the opportunity, but it's, I know that I think it was Catherine that said earlier, everything flows from healthcare. Yes, except for all the things that don't, you know? And so that's the problem. There's all kinds of things that exist on the ground that are happening despite healthcare, but inform it.
Yeah.
So how do we more constructively and strategically communicate, coordinate, and drive better outcomes?
Yep. And that was my point too before, Seven, that those people in human services and like the AAAs and all of them, they've been doing this for a long, long time. They just didn't call it social determinants of health. It was human services. And I remember Lance Robertson, when he was the secretary of ACL not too long ago, one of the statements that he would make is managed care started to take over and the health, and that's where the money was. He said to all the area and agencies, he said, you could either be Blockbuster or you could be Netflix.
You were there.
Oh yeah. Well, Lance is a good friend of mine. Yes. And
that was a big moment at our conference. Yeah.
Yes. And it's a great analogy of how in human services, we don't have the funding that health has. And so we have to work some other ways now, aggressively showing that we've been doing this for a long time and we're the experts, and to start to move that direction.
Your CEOs don't get $7 million a year, do they?
No, they don't, but they'd like to. And if they did, they would plow it back into their waiting lists, because that's what they do.
Yeah.
I mean, this is my soapbox. I think Jim kind of also shares this one, but we're medicalizing all this thing. The best and the brightest, are in the medical field, and now they're going to discover social services, and they're going to fix social services, and all because they're the best and the brightest. But also, I mean, if you really think about it from the big picture, there's a lot of wasted money there, right, in medical care, and so we should be able to suck money out of there, move it to the social services. And if we can think about how to do that without, you can hear all the noise, that there's not enough money in healthcare and unions and political kind of stuff too that goes with this. But, somebody has to pull up their pants and really start doing this. And perhaps the best way to do it is by connecting and using data, and really using the medical systems as the platforms to help the social systems develop the data sharing foundations. Because I think Kathy, I don't know if Kathy and Keela is still on, but one of the things that we're finding out in Inc. is that a lot of the social service agencies aren't sharing data with the HIEs because they don't really have the technology to do it. And, they just need a lift in that, right? And Courtney, what I would say is, I'm sure that, as Kathy was saying and others say, it's very siloed, right? And they can't even share internally, like Kathy was saying, but even within the agencies, they can't share internally because they have program requirements this way and that way, and there's nothing that does, and they don't have the technology, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the people, the informaticists that can create those linkages for them. And the only thing that they can invest in is things that return revenue to them, right? So why do they do it? Because they have to do it for the grant reporting. And those are the motivations.
Yeah, well, you're right, Paul. I mean, there's a couple of different issues here. I think one, they, like everyone, you're beholden to your funder and you have to meet the reporting requirements they set forth. And under Older Americans Act, and I think I've said this
Not
to
yet.
this group, that in every state, they have different nuanced data requirements. So under Older Americans Act, all of that data doesn't align. And I keep using this, and I apologize, it's the same example over and over. A ride in Ohio is defined differently than a ride in Florida. So those look different from a cost perspective, from a credentialing and licensing and training perspective. So now when my friends at Gravity, I'm on the Strategic Advisory Council, we create a definition for a ride over there, and you trot that out to these social service agencies, and you expect the rides to happen in the local community, and you think they're the same? They're not. They cost something different. They take different training, credentialing, licensing. So you have to understand that these original legacy funding sources have an impact on the infrastructure and the architecture of the foundation that we're now all trying to deal with. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, definitely concerned about the exchange of information, definitely concerned about the standards that exist with all of that, and concerned about what that looks like. A very good example, to your point, of folks not being able to share information. Not only do we have these disconnects from state to state with something like Older Americans Act, but move to the social health referral platforms. The social health referral platforms want INR directories for CBOs to participate with them. Our folks aren't going to share their INR data. So therefore, our folks aren't in that automated loop. How do our folks get those referrals? Sometimes it's phone call, sometimes it's an email. It's not sourced. We have no idea who those are coming from. But for folks to know and understand that in some cases, depending how things are set up, our folks might not even own their data to be able to share it, even if they wanted to. Not that they're highly motivated to. And every time we hear from a social health referral platform, oh, we can get you more referrals. Well, I'm sorry, that's a lack of social awareness. I haven't met a AAA yet that is standing on the street corner with a placard begging for more referrals.
Right.
So, and none of those referrals are coming with funding anyway. So there's some pretty big disconnects here in terms of we all sit in the seat we sit in and view the landscape from that. But because CBOs, I think, haven't been entrenched on the front end of this, that voice and perspective has been missing in terms of what are some of the disconnects, what are some of the gaps, and what are some of the barriers that are going to be really hard to crawl over if we don't figure out how to work through them. So those are some of the things I sit around and worry about. And quite frankly, it's one of the reasons that we're now coming to meetings like these, is to understand, the barriers you all have and the concerns you all have, and to try and say, hey, wait, oh gosh, we need to catch up, and we need to figure out where we do fit in and where there just be huge disconnects that we need to say, help.
Well, you know what, you need to catch up, and you also need to lead. So it's a precarious position to be in, because everything's upside down. The SDR's work has to start from those people who are providing the service, which is why Ken made a comment. The groups we work with in the Bronx, the IRB group, I forgot this, the Community Information Referral.
The Bronx Crib.
We were having this conversation actually relative to the Health Data Palooza presentation. They're now saying, hey, do you have people from disadvantaged communities part of your conversation? And we spent a lot of time actually bringing them into our conversation around the Integrated Care for Kids program in the Bronx. And we had 2, 3, 4 meetings with them. They digested some of our work. Their information is right in the executive summary of the report in terms of how those people, but also the organizations that they represent in the Bronx, and they represent a whole spectrum, want to be engaged, can be engaged, will be engaged. And you know what? Some of that is paper. They don't trust other stuff. They don't trust electronic. And it's also, they want to bring it home and talk about it with their family before they sign some official document about giving their information. So it is a mental model difference. We can try to jam technology down into your iPhone. Everybody's at 98% of people got a phone. Yeah, but they're maybe buying stuff, but interacting with services is challenging, and it's a different, and it's not in the brand new $1 billion healthcare hospital. It's in the community. So we think of connecting, right?
Well, and Daniel, I mean, you've got to remember the populations that CBOs serve.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, these are typically populations whose healthcare IQ is not great, who, you know, filling out these forms can oftentimes be difficult. They're having to meet eligibility requirements for the services that they are able to receive. Oftentimes they're housing unstable. They don't, you know, have fresh fruits and vegetables. They don't know how they're going to eat at the end of the month, much less deal with many of the other issues involved. So, you know, it's a very different community that we're dealing with when we get to the CBO world. And I think one of the things that I'm so proud that our network has done over 45 to 50 years is they have perfected the art of assessing to barrier and serving to barrier. And while we can standardize things like the prepare assessment, we can standardize data, you cannot standardize that level of person-centered service and engagement to meet every data set. And we very much worry that as you know, you march forward on rigid standards, where is our capacity going to be to continue to provide the high level of person-centered care that our folks provide? And I'll give you an example. 1 million years ago, I ran a very small, the nation's smallest nonprofit, providing services to very at-risk older Americans. They were so at risk, the AAA had a hard time serving them because you had to go into their house and serve them. I had a client, Ethel, who was homebound. She needed a transportation assistant, but she could not use the transportation through the county because she required so much assistance to get in her car. She needed somebody to walk her into the doctor. She needed tremendous help. She needed food. She needed cat food. Her cat was her only connectivity to something that lived. We were her emergency caregiver, and she finally got scabies. And let me tell you, nobody in the system would touch her with a 10-foot pole. The public health department wouldn't deal with her because they weren't sending anybody in where there was a contagious communicable disease. I mean, it was something close to a nightmare. And these are the type of real life situations that community-based organizations are managing that our data sets don't account for and can't manage. You have to leave room in the process that these CBOs can function and can continue to do their work that they've done for so long inside of the structure that you guys are trying to create.
I wanted to underline something that Courtney just said. You know, if we could we're spending all this time and focus on, you know, addressing SDOH interoperability. And if we could just magically snap our fingers and have, quote, perfect interoperability between systems, between healthcare and human services, that would not address the underlying issue that Courtney just pointed to, which is nobody's standing around from a CBO with a sign saying, give us more referrals, right? So I guess I wanted to underline that kind of irony and sad point and kind of direct that at the ONC people here. I don't mean to pick on y'all, but you know, this was going to some of the issues that we were talking about in the chat of, even if we can solve these interoperability issues, how do you ensure that there's money for the CBO? How are you sure that there's a budget that these people can actually deliver the services to address the needs?
Build back better. There needs to be a major $1 trillion infusion, and there's recognition by the administration that that's real, and it is real. And if it's not a basic income for people, then it needs to be a serious infusion of serious dollars. And there's an opportunity. That's why, just let me say one more thing, open it up, which is why I'm so excited about these freaking pilots we're going to go do this year, right? Because that is facts on the ground. That is saying, yes, we can admire the whole universe of problems. And Courtney, I would say, yes, those are the people, but we also need to think about Pareto, right? You know, most people don't need that level of care. Most people need some care, and they'll do a lot better. So we got to segment our populations. But that's why, and it's important. Otherwise, we get caught it's the most expensive, the most difficult, and people just throw up their hands and say, there's no technology solution. There's a saint.
If we do Pareto, then we have more resources to focus on the 20, right?
Right.
But this is, the CBOs exist because they have these particular niches, right? And they get a little bit of money here, and we spread out the money all over the place. And we have to do this efficiently and effectively. We can't expect them to do it. We have to give them what they need, not make them invest in getting what they need, right? Because if you think that most of these CBOs are government funded, we can, government can decide how it wants to spend its money. And so we need to just do this at a much bigger, better way to get to some standardization. Otherwise, you see what happened. You let all flowers bloom, right? And you get a kind of a mess. And then it's hard for people to backtrack, right? Because they made these investments. So we really need to think about it on a high level. But on that, I got to go. Bye, guys.
Thanks, Paul. See you.
I just want to interject here. And, we've been talking about the interoperability between healthcare and human services. And I just want to underline the fact that, as far as Brian and Eric's ontology work group, I mean, FHIR is great as far as, a framework for healthcare to share data, but there isn't an equivalent to social services. And I want to say that, Brian mentioned all the things that he's working on, but I think the most important aspect is that their ontology work group will be the equivalent for FHIR on the social services side. And when you map those two, then you could have interoperability between those two. And so I want to have ONC look at, so somehow supporting or somehow, diverting some of the funding to, being able to support that kind of effort. I mean, without a social service specific FHIR equivalent, we're going to still be stuck in this, interoperability. We talk about social determinants of health. We keep on talking about interoperability, but there is not an equivalent for FHIR, and FHIR is very healthcare centric. I don't think it's I don't think it's appropriate for social service interoperability. So, I just that's the last thing.
So Sonia, that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point of the pilots is education, food, healthcare, behavioral health, some configuration in New York and the Bronx, maybe the same or different configuration in New Jersey, a third consideration or configuration in Colorado that wants to participate. And then I think we have a interested county in California and maybe one in Minnesota. So you can actually set different sort of look at exchanging, whether it's education data or public health or emergency data. We have I think a good platform to do that. And that's what we're going to go make happen, right? And so addressing those issues and ontologies will hopefully bring that to the table, to be able to implement it and be at least be able to model it and to talk about it, so we can create that larger framework for other. Look, every county in California is going to do it. They're just whole person care in 58 counties, so
Yeah,
they're
I
going
mean,
to
it's a
connect everything.
it's a
Well,
basic, right? I mean, when we're talking about interoperability between these two systems, I mean, you don't have the basics down. You have fire, which addresses healthcare, but it's like trying to, healthify everything is it's just not
No,
going
but we, as we've discussed, we've got education's got its standards, justice has got its standards, housing has got its standards. So, human service, social service, ACF will come along soon.
Well,
And we'll whip them into shape.
and I think one
Anyway,
of the
I got
most
to drop off. Thank you.
Okay, Sonia.
one of the most important things we can do is figure out how to standardize the communication
Yeah.
between the local PCP and the local CBO, so that's how we're going to lift up patients, clients in the local community, and that's how we're going to be able to intervene with them and actually improve their health. So I think that has to be, that direct communication is key. And I'm not hearing a lot about that. I'm hearing about data exchange at a much higher, more sophisticated level, which is important. I'm not discarding that.
Well,
But
so
I don't think you can do that without that more basic fundamental connection to, that includes the CBO and the PCP being able to easily exchange information.
So Courtney, that's one of the
Yes,
things
and
that
we'll get there.
that's what we're going to do, hopefully, to help engineer or architect the workshop that Stefan's talking about, right? So how do we make sure we have those? And the report that we did actually breaks it into 4 categories. And I think I would suggest, like we have in the past, we look at those major areas. There is a technology part, there's a privacy and law, legal part of it, there's a governance part, and then there's a real what harms and what we have to watch out for, and how do we engage community. Those could be actually 4 tracks, and we can go deeper into those kinds of conversations, recognizing it's not like we got to discover it. So we're gonna follow up with this. I know Stefan and Mickey and stuff like that have a lot of interest. Everybody's got interest in it. So we're going to hopefully have some runway between now and then. And 2022 should be an amazing opportunity year if we can just align the energies and the resources and hopefully fund the kind of stuff that's going to happen. So Stefan, thanks for spending the afternoon. This is a triple overtime. This is a first. We haven't gotten a triple before. So
no worries. It's a great conversation. Glad I could stick around. I didn't have something immediately after that forced me to kick off early. I'm really glad. Thank you.
Hoping you'd see that. It's a great, amazing group of people who are just like leaning into this thing. So, with your support and efforts, we want to keep leaning forward. So
yes,
with that,
I'm looking forward to the release of the toolkit. A lot of the themes that were noted today, were definitely part of our discussion in making the toolkit. We had a technical expert panel that, and especially the viewpoint of CBOs, really highlighted some of those concerns. So looking forward to future discussions. Hoping that, we can get that out soon, since I think that could, there were a lot of echoes that were noted today.
And something else that we are dying to come out is our patient matching and identity report to Congress that we were mandated to do. It has been in the approval review process outside of our agency, in the powers that be within federal government before that goes back to Congress. And we keep hearing that it's close. So that can come out very soon, or who knows, it can get pushed back again and not come out for a while. But we are hoping that, we were pretty much done with the majority of our draft, towards, the end of last year, or even a little before then. And it's just gone, this vicious cycle into, bureaucratic red tape. But when that comes out, it's really well written, and there's some great things in there that I think that this community would really appreciate. And I did want to also point out, always looking to include all the perspectives that need to be at the table, the CBOs who represent and employ community health workers, and also the populations that they serve, those specific community health workers themselves, who are using these tools or in the field, as well as those populations. And I can tell you, in the White House series, they were very intentional that in the invite-only roundtable parts, like the one that I'm going to be co-moderating tomorrow, we've got CBOs involved that were invited, We've got CHWs that are involved that were invited to be part of this conversations. But we're always looking for how we can improve on having really good diverse representation. So Courtney, thank you for your comments on that. I completely agree with you. You know, it's a challenging task to make sure you get everybody at the table, but that's one of the things
really hard.
ONC, that's one of the things that is our charge. We're a coordinator. We're supposed to know who all the stakeholders are and make sure that they're represented and invite them to be part of it. And we are always kind of doing that behind the scenes with our sister agencies. I know we're working with them saying like, hey, you should also include so-and-so. We should bring this group, you know. And if we don't do that, they say, why didn't you tell about this group that we didn't know about? You know, we're like, you guys should have known. And we're like, we missed it.
Well, and I've seen a lot of progress over the last 18 months in specifically the space. You know, as people say, oh, you're a CBO. Oh, good. Let me talk to you, which, you know, that never happened before. So, you know, that's
18 months.
That's kind of nice.
Yeah,
that's kind of nice. But it's, you know, I guess I come down to my mom told me a long time ago, you only know what you know. And there's all kinds of people that know other stuff you don't know. Go talk to them. And I think that's important for us to do, to understand the rest of the space. And I think also understanding there's a unique expertise here. And I think that's the piece that I want to continue to push forward, is that the CBOs and social service providers do have a unique expertise to share and to embed into the system without healthcare just dwarfing it and taking it over.
Completely agree.
So this has been awesome. If I don't go, I won't get my car from the car dealer service department, and then I'll be in a lot of trouble.
I will officially close the ceremonial activities today. Thanks, everybody. It was great. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.